Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the first evening event of the Georgetown University Library Associates for the year 2014-2015. My name is Artemis Kirk, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's program and to our speaker, Alina García-Lapuerta. I want very much to thank the Center for Latin American Studies for co-sponsoring this evening's event, and to the many people in the Georgetown University Library staff who have worked hard to put this event together and make it possible. Our speaker, Alina García-Lapuerta, holds degrees from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Born in Havana but raised in the United States, García-Lapuerta and her subject, Mercedes Santa Cruz y Montalvo, share a birthplace as well as cross-cultural experiences. These shared experiences and heritage sparked Alina's interest in Mercedes, and as she researched further, her researches led her from the United States to Cuba, Spain, France, and England. She discovered a woman with a starring role in 19th century Parisian society who held musical and literary salons and eventually joined the ranks of writers herself. Alina's book weaves together stories, memoirs, travel writings, and personal correspondence that followed La Belle Créole from Havana to Madrid and Paris. It reveals a portrait of an unusually modern and sophisticated daughter of Creole aristocracy, and it poses a number of questions of nationality and identity. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the author of La Belle Créole, Alina García-Lapuerta.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming here tonight. Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming here tonight, and I just wanted to take a few moments to also thank Artemis Kirk, everyone at the library, at Lowinger Library, especially in the Library Associates, and also the Center for Latin American Studies, for making it possible for me to present my biography, La Belle Créole, the Cuban countess who captivated Havana, Madrid, and Paris. For me, it is, of course, a special delight to be here at Georgetown after so long, because this is the place where I first took courses in Latin American history and other things to do with international studies. And really, all of those studies that I started here helped me on this road to tracing the life of this woman who at one point was so well known and so famous, and yet somehow has become a bit forgotten in history. Just gonna make sure. Mercedes Santa Cruz y Montalvo, La Condesa de Merlin, is a figure who transcended borders and cultures. She was born in colonial Cuba. She came of age in Napoleonic Spain, and she became a star in 19th century Parisian society. Following in her footsteps became for me a journey that not only took me to different places, to different countries, but also to parts of history and culture that I really had never studied before. So for me, it was an amazing way to learn about other places, something that I hope I share in the book. When I started looking at Mercedes's life, one thing that I quickly found out was that if people knew about Mercedes at all, they knew about one aspect of her life. But very few people actually knew about the whole life. And this is, again, something that I've tried to bring out in the biography, the whole life of this woman. Because when I started studying her, it became apparent to me that to truly understand her, you had to trace 3 strands that ran throughout her life. And if you didn't look at the different strands, you really couldn't understand the whole life. Another thing that was important also was seeing the life in its historical context. Because Mercedes was an extraordinary character, and she lived in extraordinary times. But if you didn't understand the historical context, you really couldn't appreciate how she managed to triumph and her achievements. Another thing that became clear to me also was that there were aspects of, another thing had to be understood in order to really appreciate her life. Throughout her life, politics and the major events of the day influenced almost every aspect of her life, even to the most trivial details. The tumultuous times that she lived in from 1789 to 1852 saw Napoleonic battles, the loss of empires, revolutions, sudden reversals of fortunes, and all of these things impacted on her life to very great degrees. As an example of what I mean by this, I'm going to share a little story from the research that I did. I wanted to find out a little bit more about Mercedes's journey to Spain that she took in 1802 when she left Cuba with her father, Joaquín de Santa Cruz y Cárdenas, the Conde de Jaruco y de Mopox. Mercedes had written a little bit about it in her memoirs, but I wanted to flesh out the story for the book and look into it. Now, luckily, her father was returning to Spain for so to speak, on government official business, and therefore he had to provide a report to the bureaucracy of the day in Madrid. And therefore he had to write a very detailed letter explaining everything once he arrived in Cádiz. So we learned the name of the ship he was on, the admiral who squadron was, the ship was with, and we know the exact dates that he left Havana and when they arrived in Cádiz. So we found out that the name of the ship is Neptuno, the admiral is Gravina, and we know the exact dates they sailed out of Havana and they arrived in Cádiz. Now, Gravina was one of Spain's greatest sailors, and that I found fascinating in and of itself. He would die about a year after the Battle of Trafalgar from the wounds he suffered there. And I wanted to understand a little bit more. Why was Gravina in the Caribbean? Why would he pick them up as passengers in Havana? So I started looking into that story. And what I found was absolutely fascinating. In 1802, Napoleon decided to send an enormous force to recapture the lost French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is today Haiti, which had suffered, of course, the great slave uprising and revolution. Because Napoleon had very complex treaties with Spain, he was able to actually demand aid from the Spanish to help him in this endeavor. And so Gravina and his squadron had to go along with the French fleet to offer support. This French fleet was headed by Napoleon's brother-in-law, General Leclerc, and it included, as a civilian passenger, his own sister, Pauline Bonaparte. When they arrived there, the French met with immediate success, and they felt very comfortable with the situation. They would ultimately lose, but at that point they thought they had won. And they released Gravina to return to Spain. A normal route from the Caribbean to Cádiz would stop in Havana, and therefore Gravina went there. He happened to be friends with the Santa Cruz family. Joaquín, Mercedes's father, was waiting just for this perfect opportunity, because since this was still the time of great sea battles, the fights with the English and such, it was still a dangerous time to travel, even though there was a temporary truce. Gravina welcomed the family on his boat, on Neptuno, and they sailed off to Spain. Now, if you think about how one plans, journeys today, any kind of travel arrangements, it's not a very complex or difficult thing. Whether you decide to take this airline or you take this ship, if you're taking a cruise or what have you, it's a very trivial fact. But for Mercedes, even deciding this particular, this small, seemingly trivial thing, it was influenced by Napoleon's decision to retake a lost colony and by the consequences of the Haitian Revolution. In Mercedes's case, even the ship she sailed on was at the mercy of geopolitics. And so it would go on for the rest of her life. At all stages, the political and world events would turn her world upside down. So to start understanding and tracing the life, to look at the three strands, the first one is obviously Cuba. This is an image of the cathedral, the Plaza de la Catedral in Old Havana. Cuba is the starting point, and it's a thread that runs obviously throughout her entire life. Her early childhood, her understanding of her family's place within that Creole society, their economic importance, their history, their influence, was something that would inform all of her adult life. She idolized her childhood, running wild in the Cuban countryside, the unconditional love that she received from her great grandmother, her beloved mamita, the place that she had in a large and extended family, all of these things would influence her for the rest of her life, because no matter what happened in the world, she always knew who she was and where she came from. And I really think that's something that gave her an inner strength to face all the changed circumstances that she would constantly find. Now, I just wanted to read a little excerpt from the book that kind of gives you a flavor for what I mean. Mamita's Havana home was busy, like most Havana homes, including the Gran Casas. It had offices or businesses located on the lower floor. The comings and going of business associates would only have added to the general household bustle, including the enormous family gatherings. The centrality of the extended family is not just a modern Latin phenomenon, but rather one rooted in a time when family ties were often the most reliable ones, and where family protection was crucial for the advancement and security. Blood kin could be trusted, or so was the general belief. For a little girl, far away from her own nuclear family, belonging to this rich tapestry of life would have been a fundamental impact, creating a foundation for which she would always search or wish throughout her entire life. The second strand that obviously influenced Mercedes was Spain. Spain was where Mercedes was introduced to her mother and to her Spanish-born siblings. And when I say introduced, I really do mean the word introduced, because Mercedes's parents sailed off for Spain when she was just 2 months old. And her mother, Teresa Montalvo, who's pictured on the right there, never returned to Cuba at all. So when Mercedes arrived as a 13-year-old teenager in 1802 in Spain, she literally met her mother for the first time. And it was in Spain, this time in Spain, with this really odd family dynamic that she had, that introduced her to the idea that love had to be earned. It wasn't going to always be unconditional, in contrast to what she had felt in Cuba. And it's also in Spain that she really first learned to live with all this political turmoil that would affect the rest of her life. It's important to remember that her family in Spain, just like they were in Cuba, were at the heart of the political establishment, and that even after the death of her father, her mother was under the protection of their uncle, Gonzalo O'Farrell, who was another Cuban-born person in Spain. He was a general, and he had been ambassador to Berlin, and he briefly was also Fernando VII's Minister of War before Napoleon conquered Spain. Now, to give a sense of how much turmoil Mercedes had to live with during this time, from 1808 to 1812, Mercedes was forced to flee Madrid 3 times. The first time was with her family shortly after Joseph Bonaparte, who's pictured there on the right, took over the Spanish throne. There was an unexpected victory by the Spanish side against the French, and Joseph ordered the evacuation of the city. Gonzalo O'Farrell, for very complex reasons, which I get into in the book, but it's a little too much to discuss here, decided to side with the French. I mean, this was something that split all of Spanish society, and it's where the Peninsular War, which you might be familiar with, comes from, and that the Spaniards called La Guerra de Independencia, their War of Independence. So once they decided to support the French, when the French fled, so did Mercedes and her family. And it was for political reasons that her family also encouraged the marriage to a French general, Christophe Antoine Merlan, who's pictured there, who was about 20 years her senior. And then it was Wellington's victory at a battle in Arapiles, which actually forced the final evacuation of Madrid for Mercedes in 1812. That was when she, and along with about 30,000 civilians and soldiers were forced to flee in August, the hottest point of the summer, from the Meseta in Madrid, crossing down to the Mediterranean in Valencia. It was a horrific journey. They hardly had water, people didn't have food, and she had a newborn daughter that she had to take care of at the same time. And once she arrived in Valencia, she was told that as the wife of a French officer, she would have to continue on across the Pyrenees into France and into exile, which is where she went. And it's France, which is the third strand of her story. And it's here that I really think Mercedes comes into her own. Mercedes really becomes the person that we can recognize today. It's at almost the lowest point in her family's fortune. After the loss of their Spanish properties, after the quagmire of litigation, which is the legacy that her father left with his very complicated estate, there was disputes and lawsuits for almost 30 years going on. When they had lost all their power and prestige, it was at this point that Mercedes actually seized control of her own life and decided to reshape it. And it was at this point that she stops being considered just the daughter of someone, the niece of someone, or the wife of someone, and she becomes simply known as the Comtesse Merlan, the star of 19th century Parisian society. Now, her uncle Gonzalo O'Farrell has left us a letter, a very interesting letter addressed to Joseph Bonaparte from 1824. He had remained close with Joseph, and they corresponded for years. O'Farrell was in his somewhat impoverished exile in Paris, and Joseph was in his slightly more luxurious exile in his estate in New Jersey. They corresponded for some time. And in this letter, what's interesting about it is that you can really see the contrast between how Mercedes responded to exile and how other people in her family responded to exile. And again, I'll just read a little excerpt from that. O'Farrell, widowed since 1816, saw little of the world except his compatriots and companions in misfortune, and lived on the income supplied by his numerous siblings in Havana. Still, he never expressed self-pity, even while writing of the death in 1823 of his stepson Pedro, whom I loved like a son and my best friend, and of Pedro's inconsolable widow, Pepita, who now focused on their only daughter. After this somber recital, General O'Farrell turned to brighter news. Madame Merlan, he wrote, has very much perfected her musical talent and is very much en vogue and the toast of the capital. Mercedes began her transformation by doing something very French. She started a musical salon. I mean, salons in France before the revolution, even during the revolution, during empire, and in Mercedes's day were very, very popular and one of the things to do. She was a very talented amateur soprano, and it was this talent which gave her, it was like a calling card to that world, because that world adored music. Paris at the time was probably the cultural capital of Europe, and all the great musicians of the day would go there. And her salon became known as the passport for celebrity for any new artist that would arrive. And she also was able to do something else, which is that she made it possible for other talented society people, and there were quite a few very talented amateurs who practiced their music very diligently because it was quite the pastime of the day. She made it possible for them to perform in public with professionals. And that may not sound like a big thing, but you have to understand during that time, it was absolutely taboo for someone of that time period, of that social standing, to actually perform in public, let alone with a professional on stage. But Mercedes realized that if they found a good reason, a charitable cause, something worthy, then that would be acceptable. And so she started what became a very popular thing in Paris, and what you would call today probably the benefit concert. And they did these for all sorts of things. They did them for Greek independence from the Turks, Polish refugees, earthquake victims from Martinique. If there was a cause, they could do a benefit concert for it, and they did. And sometimes they spent more money on their dress than they actually raised in funds, but that was also went along with the society. French newspapers and journals and memoirs of the day are full of details of her musical soirees, her concerts, and her mass balls. She entertained not only the stars of the musical world, people such as Rossini and Liszt and the great singers of the day, but she also entertained the literary world. She was friends with Balzac. Dumas wrote about her salon in one of his early novels. She knew all the journalists and editors of the day, as well as all the politicians and also the creme of society in other ways. So she really brought all of society together in her salon. And it was also at that time that she began to write. She started by writing her memoirs, first of her time in Cuba as a child, then in Spain, and later began writing other things, such as a biography of one of the great opera singers of the day, La Malibran, and novels, and eventually the work that, if you know her today, it's probably because of a work she did on colonial Cuban society, which in Spanish is Viaje a La Habana, Voyage to Havana. All of this is particularly astonishing if you take into account that she is a foreigner. She's not French, but she's succeeding in French society. She's working in another language because she's a native Spanish speaker, not a French speaker. All her books are published originally in French. And she's also a woman. A Cuban woman at the time would never published. She really is the first Cuban female writer. Cuban women certainly would have opinions, which they would share at home, but they did not enter the public sphere of life like Mercedes did. And even in Europe, where more women did participate in writing and other things, it still wasn't something that very common. It was still rather astonishing, especially, as I said, when you add to the fact that she is not a native of France. I mean, there are actually articles written at the time that express that astonishment and ask the question, how has this woman become such a fixture in French society when most people are basically taken up for back then, the 5 minutes of fame or something, and then spit back out after Paris gets bored with you. But she has stayed for, many, many years. So all of this, it's not surprising then that in 1840, Mercedes decides to go back to Cuba. And it's not surprising that, given all her fame in Europe, that in Cuba, in the island, they're quite anticipating her visit. So 38 years after she's left the island, as a 13-year-old teenager, she returns a real star. And it's in Cuba, when you read the newspaper accounts of her visits, of her return, I mean, they're really a revelation. I mean, they covered every detail of her visit, every concert she performed in, every party she attended. It's full of flowery poems that praise her in the typical style of the day. And it really was a fascinating thing to study. It's also probably the part that more people are familiar with, this part of this voyage that she did, this trip. For me, it was also one of the most complex parts to research, because the reason for her traveling, which has to do with very complex family financial problems, has always been the stuff of legends. I mean, people have thought of all kinds of reasons why she went, and when I finally I decided I really wanted to know the answer, so I kept digging and digging and digging. And when I finally had all the pieces lined up, I thought to myself, even the way these pieces have lined up is just like Mercedes's life. It's like all these different strands, because we needed in the end an estate inventory, which is housed in the National Archives in France. I needed a handbook on Cuba, a 19th century handbook on Cuba, which is housed at the University of Miami. And those two pieces are what finally led us to some really long forgotten and buried contracts in the archives in Havana. So it's just like Mercedes. You needed all the different strands to pull together to really understand her journey there. When she went to Cuba, this trip was also, besides a trip to the past, revisiting her childhood and also sorting out financial problems, it also gave her the idea for her new project. She saw a Cuba that had changed so much from her childhood. It had really transformed. It had boomed. It was now the powerhouse of sugar, and that brought along all kinds of social changes that had happened and tensions with the government between the government in Cuba and the government in Spain. And she decided that she was going to write a book. And that book, it's a shorter Spanish version, Viaje a La Habana, chronicles colonial Cuban life and is often quoted today. And then there was a longer, fuller version in French, which covered other aspects, just, she covered the economy and the judiciary and administrative life and was more complex. But that book really came out of that journey that she took to the past. After her journey, she returned to France. She struggled for a while still financially. She reopened her salon. She continued to a certain extent. She only did one more trip to Cuba in her life in 1849, and that was a completely different trip. I mean, the contrast when you look at the newspapers and try to find the coverage, it's a quiet trip. She was suffering already from illness and just all the effects of the financial struggles she had had throughout the years. And after that, she dies in Paris in 1852. But when you really look back at her life, it's clear that throughout her life, it's her and her writings, especially her memoirs of her Cuban childhood and her Viaje a La Habana, that she never forgot her homeland. She never forgot where she came from. And it's in her lyrical descriptions of her Cuban land and of the people, and especially and ironically when you read them in the original French, which is how she wrote them, that it really recalls the language of exile and of longing and of an emigre. She captured this sense of a wish to return to the past that a lot of people feel. And it's something that I think transcends what perhaps a Cuban feels today, if they're away from their homeland and in exile. Anyone really who's left their home behind, who's left where they were originally, when they read her words, they get that same sense. And it's this emotion that I think resonates to this day. And I think it's what partially fascinates people. I've had people tell me when they read those descriptions how evocative they are. And I think that's something that she will always be known for. And I just want to finish with an excerpt from some of Mercedes's words on her arrival in Havana in 1840. Mercedes finally arrived around the 7th of June. Already, as the ship passed the Bahamas, she delighted in the warm and fragrant air of the tropics, which also elicited a rush of memories and emotions. She wrote, "The sun, the stars, all seem to be grander, more diaphanous, more splendid. My vision cannot absorb it all, nor enjoy it all. My heart cannot contain my breast cannot contain my heart. I cry like a child. I am crazed with happiness." Even after 38 years away, Mercedes still felt a passionate love for this land. I recognize that neither the distance nor the years have been able to cool my first love. As the Christopher Columbus entered the fabled Havana harbor, Mercedes thought she recognized houses, churches, and other familiar sights. But the harbor she entered would have been significantly busier than the one she left in 1802. The overall impression was of one of movement and confusion, songs mixed with the yelling by an assortment of people of every shade and type. No matter how much she remembered from the past, the reality was, as she wrote, animated and ardent like the sun. Her uncle Juanito and his sons welcomed Mercedes by meeting her boat in the harbor. Eventually, she disembarked in front of the old Basilica of San Francisco de Asís, almost facing the house where her father had died. The Montalvo family lived in the immense house on Calle de Cuba, built by Mateo Pedroso in 1780, and still known by his name. Stepping through the enormous wooden outer doors into the soaring gateway, how could Mercedes not have felt nostalgic, seeing the flower-filled vast central courtyard and looking up at the two upper galleries with their graceful columns and airy interconnecting rooms? From its balconies and windows, Mercedes could see and hear the harbor. The family enjoyed the fabled breezes by dining in the gallery itself, spreading out a table to include all the children, grandchildren, and guests. The numerous younger cousins surrounded her, asking her coquettishly, "Do you know me?" Overwhelmed, Mercedes mixed up relatives, causing laughter all around. She particularly awaited the arrival of her brother, who often resided outside of Havana, as well as her great-uncle, Rafael O'Farrell, Mamita's son and Gonzalo O'Farrell's brother. When Mercedes finally saw him, his poignant resemblance to his mother brought forth a rush of memories. mamita, her house, my adoration for her generosity, my childhood life, all was there again in this living reminder of the past. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely.
Alina will take questions from the audience. I have a number of them, but I'll wait. Please feel free to ask questions, and
I'll
she
answer.
will talk.
I'll try. So then,
I'm fascinated with why her mother stayed in France and in Spain, and her father took her so little
yes.
to Cuba. So
I think that's something that shocks everyone. Every time I mention that, people come up to me and say, what? So they left originally because I don't think they intended to leave forever originally. They wanted to set themselves up in the court. It was a typical thing. They wanted, to increase their influence and their status, so to speak. And I think also there was an interest from some of their families to go to send someone they knew to Spain to kind of represent some of the families from Cuba. Her mother really liked Spain. It seemed like she was, became very happy. She had her own successful salon, actually. She was very well known. They had children there. Her father returned because he had a military assignment. They had actually sent him back in a position, a very important position. She was almost 9 years old when he arrived. Why her mother never came back and why they didn't just send for her, send someone to take her over to Spain once they realized that they were really settled, I find it very baffling. Her father was very warm, loving. She adored her father. I think her mother, there was less of a good relationship there. I mean, if you read the memoirs, it's really interesting because she's constantly, this is where I get the sense that she had to earn the love, because she actually says that she thinks her mother loved her Spanish-born children with the unconditional love that a mother would give a child, but that she didn't have that same relationship with Mercedes, that Mercedes had to earn, had to be good, she had to study, she had to do well in order to please her mother.
and she was one of the older children?
She was the oldest surviving child. There was a brother who was also left in Cuba. He died when he was around 9, so right after the father arrives in Cuba, the eldest boy dies. So Mercedes is really left, she's the eldest child. But there's no clear explanation why they didn't just, maybe have someone else send her to Spain, or, accompanying her to Spain. And it was and I think it's something that marked her for the rest of her life, because you really get a sense that once she arrived in Spain, she always realized that she had to sort of perform to people, because she couldn't count on someone just, loving her for sure. She had this sense, and I think she wanted to recreate what she had in Cuba, that big extended family. She was always kind of looking for that. I think it's definitely, psychologically, you could go probably get someone to really look at it, because I think it is something that really, really affected her. Maybe pushed her to succeed too, to kind of show what she could do. But yeah, and it's kind of a traumatic thing. Yes?
I'm curious, anyone so beautiful and so on, what happened in her love life?
In her love life.
Did she have lovers?
Well, yes, she did. But the first thing that's interesting is that her marriage, which started off arranged, did become a love match very quickly, because we have her love letters that were written during kind of the honeymoon period, except her husband had to go fight down in Andalusia, so she wrote to him all the time for during several months that they were separated. And they're quite, her letters are quite passionate. She was just constantly telling him how much she loved him and missed him and this and that. I think that I suspect that, even though he was older and what have you, he was quite dashing. He was a cavalry general, and and I think she sort of, I want to say maybe she saw a bit of a father figure in him. He was actually about the same age as her father had been when he died. So I think for her, there was something that she admired. There were rumors that I could never verify that she might have had some affairs during their marriage while she was in France. She very definitely had a long-term lover after she was widowed. And he also kind of helped her in the writing of Viaje a La Habana. Actually, he was kind of a collaborator, editor. And he is not one of my favorite characters, because I think he did not deserve her. She was much better than he was. He was a bit of a scoundrel, a user, a social climber, a few things like that. But, she really fell for him, because we, again, have those letters. And when Mercedes is passionate, she's passionate. And she just, the writing is all there, and she just tells you. So, so it was interesting. There's also was a rumor that her mother had an affair with Joseph Bonaparte, which I would believe, given Joseph Bonaparte had an affair with practically everybody. He couldn't resist women. And there was even a rumor that he made a move towards Mercedes, because there's an anecdote that he asked her husband, so Merlin, what would you do if a king courted your wife? And Merlin just turned to me and he said, sire, I would kill him, And he was like, oh, Merlin, you have no sense of humor at all, But they were like, it's possible, because Joseph really, we have a great letter that Joseph wrote to Mercedes after she published her memoir. She sent him a copy, and he wrote her back like this 4-page letter. Part of it was annoyed about certain points of how she described Napoleon and how she described, his reaction in certain battles and such like that. But the other part was constantly reminiscing about her and her family, and how he had always thought she was beautiful, and he thought her mother and her uncle were wonderful. And so he was clearly very close to the family. That's very obvious. So it's interesting. Yes, sorry.
Were there other brothers and sisters that lived in Spain from the same father? Or?
Yes. They were both born from the same marriage. She had a brother who's the one that became the Conde de Jaruco and Mopox, and he went back to Cuba. Actually, he had been sent to study in France, then he was stuck there during the whole Peninsular War, and then they managed to bring him back to Spain. And it was actually Joseph Bonaparte who then told him he should go back to Cuba, because he had to settle all those estates, which were a mess. And so he managed to escape from French-controlled Spain through Spanish, the other part of Spain, and then he got to Cuba. And he pretty much stayed in Cuba the whole time. So Mercedes didn't see him very much. Her sister was with her in Spain the whole time, married a kind of a relative, and went into French exile also. And she died quite young, and Mercedes raised her daughter. And that daughter then married Mercedes' son. So she kept it all in the family there. So yeah. Mercedes, she had 4, 3 of whom survived into adulthood.
And did she introduce them to Cuba as well, or people in France?
No, well, one of them I don't think ever went to Cuba, or at least we don't have, her daughter never went to Cuba. Her eldest son, Francois, probably never went to Cuba. At least we don't have anything documented. But her youngest son, Gonzalo, went back with her on that trip in 1849, and he married a cousin from Cuba. And then they went back to Paris. But after Mercedes' death many years later, he eventually moved back to Cuba, and he actually died in Havana. Yeah, which was interesting. Yes?
On your blog, you talk about doing research in Havana.
Yes.
And that is very evocative. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it felt like to walk in her footsteps and find all these old documents that maybe people haven't seen in a very long time.
Yeah. Well, going back to Havana for me was incredible, because I think I had done one trip while I was here actually in Georgetown as a student, and that was it. I hadn't gone back since I had left as a small child. But before going to Havana, I had spent all this time reading about old Havana, the society, the city, the wall. It was a walled city at the time, looking at old maps, finding out, all the houses where she would have lived in, or people she knew lived in, or had something to do with her story. So when I went back, it really was strange, because I had never really been to that part of old Havana, but I knew all these streets. And I would walk by a building, I'd be like, oh my God, there's the La Casa de la Obra Pia. And every people were like, okay, yeah, I get really excited about that. But, or I would go and say, is this house? And they would say, yes, it was the house of the Beatas Cárdenas, or this is the convent of Santa Clara. We had to basically bribe sometimes to get in, because some of them were being renovated, they wouldn't let you in. So the convent where she had spent time, there's a story about her in the convent, I really wanted to see it. And I think officially it was being renovated, but and it was late in the afternoon, so it should have been closed. But as soon as the guard saw us coming, he was waving us to come in. I'm like, is it open? And he was like, sure, it costs 6 cooks, pay me in cash and I'll give you a tour. I'm like, okay. I'm sure it was all illegal, but he let us in, and then he took us all around. And I think he was used to tourists going there, because he kept telling us every ghost story he could think of about the convent, like bodies buried, underneath, screams in the middle of the night, rooms where you get icy, he was telling us everything. So, but it was really emotional, actually. I felt like I really recognized places. And the documents are incredible, especially all of them, but especially I think some of the Cuban ones, because yes, some of those had not been touched. And some of them are in very bad condition, but they were really amazing, because that's where you really start getting a sense of the history, because it's real. It's more than just a name now that you've read somewhere. It's actually, you see people's signatures. Seeing her signature on her marriage contract, that was really amazing to me, because it was so naive and so childlike. She was 20 years old, but you could just see she was still very young. And then you contrast it with her signature years later, in letters just to friends when she's in France, and it's much more stylized. So, seeing things like that actually brings the things to life. I think they really do. So, any other question? Yes? Hi.
What does the word Creole refer to in the title of the
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I actually felt that I thought it was going to be asked enough that I put it in the introductory notes, because so for her, when the French would call her La Belle Créole, which was a nickname sometimes they called her, they were just really referencing the fact that she was born in Cuba. Okay, so criollo, Creole, even to the French, just meant someone born on the islands. Actually, to them, mostly of European descent, but so that you weren't born in France or you weren't born in Spain, but you were born over there. And over time, I think it's changed a little bit. But in Cuba, at least, if you say something's criollo, all it means is that it's Cuban. It's from there. You can refer to food. You can refer to, styles or customs or things like that. So it really, in that sense, didn't mean anything more. Josephine, Bonaparte's wife, Napoleon's wife, was also called a Creole all the time, because she was born in Martinique, but she was, of French European descent. Anyway, yeah?
You mentioned that she had some financial difficulties at the end, or her husband did?
Yes.
She was running a salon. Was it ever a profitable business, or was it just sort of an expensive hobby?
It's just expense, because at least you don't really make, there was no money to be made in that sense. I mean, she made some money writing, that she would get paid for. But the salon was just a very expensive hospitality. I mean, and actually, it was one of the questions that I had. They always say follow the money, and you can try to find a lot. You could actually answer a lot of things doing that. And I spent a lot of time chasing down her father's estate and trying to understand what money was available, because I could not understand for the longest time how she managed to host this fabulous salon. It's extremely expensive, and he didn't have that income coming in. I mean, we kind of knew what he earned as a general and a few other properties they had, and it didn't make sense. She I think, relied quite a bit on the bits and pieces of money that came from Cuba as her brother kept paying her part of the estate, but that was always a mess, which is why after her husband's death, it all kind of got worse. Because in French law, you immediately have to divide the estate with the children and the widow, and so that all of a sudden cut her income. The other thing, though, that helped her was, because I couldn't understand their house. They lived in a very grand apartment, which was part of like a townhouse, one of these private townhouses in France. And I thought it was a little bit beyond their means to have such a grand establishment, let alone the hospitality. But I found out that they actually were incredibly good friends with the owners of the actual entire building is the Hotel Lariboisière. And the Lariboisière family, or at least the wife, the Countess Lariboisière, was one of the richest heiresses in Paris, in France. Her father had been a finance minister or something like that, and he had left her a fortune. She owned that hotel. I'm convinced they were very good friends. I mean, her husband was even a pallbearer at General Merlan's funeral. I'm convinced they either gave them a very good deal or even just let them live. They had like a whole floor. The Lariboisières had another floor and things like that. And they both had salons and hosted and co-hosted things and such like that. So I think she had good friends who sort of helped her in lots of ways. And but her voice also helped. The fact that she was so talented and that the musicians all loved her, they performed for free for her. Whereas if, for example, Baron Rothschild would throw a big party and he wanted to have those same singers and musicians come, they would charge per piece of music that they performed, actually, and it was quite expensive. But for Mercedes, they did it they considered her, part of their world, and if anything, they profited by the publicity when they performed there. But at the end, she couldn't keep it up. She finally did have to kind of scale down at the very end. So, yeah, sorry.
In terms of her national identity,
Yes.
would she identify as Cuban, Spanish, French? How would she fit in all
Yeah.
of these different cultures, and how did they perceive her?
So that's a good question, too, because it actually came to a head when she wrote The Voyage to Havana, to Viaje a La Habana. Because once she wrote that, the Cubans started going crazy because they didn't always like everything she wrote, and there were certain people attacking her in the press saying that she had come to Cuba, that she had hardly ever lived there, she had no right to, describe certain things, that she had viewed the whole thing with Parisian eyes, and that was like an insult. On the other hand, you just read about it. She clearly felt Cuban by birth. She felt that was her homeland. After so many years in France, she was very comfortable in France. I don't know if she ever really considered herself French. Because when you do see what she writes, it's this constant repetition of how much she adored, her homeland, that this was her homeland, and she could never forget that this was her family. I don't think she ever thought of herself as Spanish. The Cubans thought of themselves as part of the Spanish Empire at the time. They were very much a citizen of the empire, but they were also Cuban. And by the time she went back to Cuba, that's just the beginning of the whole kind of nationalism starting in Cuba. In France, there was a reviewer who wrote in his review of her memoirs, describing her, and they said that, it was hard to believe that someone, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but basically it was something like, she was a Creole who was so French and a French woman who was still so Creole. It was something like that. She obviously had a duality. But the question of identity is something that I think every time someone reads about her or talks about her, especially if they're Cuban, it becomes something that they debate. And I've been asked this question actually quite a bit, especially down in Miami. They were asking me that a lot. Any other question? Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that she's been a refugee. Can you speak a little bit about what her experience was being in exile and crossing the Pyrenees and the hardships that she endured?
Yeah.
And did you, in doing all this research, did you see any parallels or any lessons that women today can learn from her experiences?
Well, so when she went on that exile, first leaving Madrid, I don't think they even realized that they were going to have to continue on to France. It was a really difficult, they were under constant fear of attack by the guerrillas, the guerrilla, which is where the word comes from, So the guerrilla during the Peninsular War was constantly attacking the French convoys as they were trying to get to France. It was so dangerous that her husband actually got 25 extra soldiers to try to protect her and their daughter. They had to go part of the way in a carriage, and then when they were actually going to cross the Pyrenees, they had to switch to mules. So it was like a mule train, and she refused to get on a mule because by this point she was feeling ill, she was hysterical. Her husband was staying in Spain, her uncle was staying in Spain, her sister was staying in Spain, and she was the only one being shipped off. And they finally had to get her a sedan chair, one of those carry chairs to put her in. And even so, mules kept falling down the Pyrenees and being lost. She lost part of, her baggage. Mules kept falling. It was just a disaster. She got there, and it turns out that the soldiers that went back, she later heard were attacked by the guerrilla, and actually some of them were killed. So I think it must have been very difficult her the first years in France because she didn't enter, you would think, oh, her husband's French, okay, she's arrived in France, how bad can it be? It was one of the most tumultuous times in French history. That was the year, Napoleon's lost in Russia, so now everybody decides it's time to go attack. Napoleon is now weak. And for the first time since the revolution, other armies start attacking actual French soil. So the battle comes back to France. Up to now it's been, in Spain, it's been in Austria, it's been in Italy. All of it comes back. So France becomes a war zone. There's one story, for example, they had bought a country place and they found that the Prussians ended up taking over it. And, her maid slept with a knife across in front of her doorway because she was like really nervous what would happen to her with these people. They couldn't like stay here, they had to go there. I mean, they were kind of homeless. Her husband wasn't officially in the army. Then when the battle started, he joined up again to fight for France. I mean, there was really no stability. And then, one other thing with her husband, when Napoleon falls, but then he gets exiled to Elba, but he comes back for the 100 days. And all these French officers who have just sworn, loyalty to the new French king have to decide, do they go back to Bonaparte or do they stay loyal? And I have to say, a lot of them, most of them went over back to Napoleon, and so did her husband. So after he gets defeated again, he's practically court-martialed. He manages not to get court-martialed but he goes before a special commission, and it almost ends his entire career. So I would say from like 1812 when she got there until late 20s, 1820s, it was a horrible time for her. They were under surveillance, I think the fact that she was strong enough to then kind of still come out of that and start her salon, and obviously she must have been making friends during the time, because you just don't open a door one day and say, I have a salon. She was obviously cultivating connections and doing stuff. I think it says a lot to her. This is what I mean, that I think that sense of self that she had from Cuba, that she really knew who she was, it didn't matter if all these other trappings were gone. I don't think she ever doubted for a moment who she was, that she had a certain position. I don't know, she just really thought she knew who she was. And I think that is what helped her survive in another country, even through difficult years. And things became a little easier later on, but I think that sense of self, I do think it helped her be a strong person. So, yes. So I first heard of her because her Viaje a La Habana sometimes is quoted in those, big photo books of old Havana. And there was this reference to this Cuban woman who was in Paris, who had come back. And I just thought it was fascinating that there was a Cuban woman in 19th century Paris. And what was she doing there? And I just wanted to know more about her story. And when I started looking into it, it was difficult to find anything coherent. But then when I started looking into it, I was just fascinated by her story. And there it came. So.
Hasn't this been wonderful? Thank you.
Thank you.